Hi, good afternoon. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. On behalf of the NYU Journal of International Law and Politics, I'd like to welcome you to the 24th Annual Herbert Rubin and Justice Rose Luton Rubin International Law Symposium, entitled Around the World on One Belt, One Road, Foreign Capital Competition and Development in the 21st Century. Today we will be discussing the changing dynamics of global development finance policy within the context of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Announced in 2013 by People's Republic of China President Xi Jinping, the Belt and Road Initiative is a $1 trillion global infrastructure investment plan that focuses on enhancing trade networks between China and the rest of the world through a belt of overland corridors and a road of maritime shipping lanes. Countries across Asia, Europe, Africa, and South America have pledged support. Beijing has boasted that it is the project of the century. Many have compared it to the US-led Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after World War II. President Xi has described the initiative as economic cooperation and an open and inclusive process. While some countries have welcomed the financing from China, others, including most recently Sierra Leone, Malaysia, and Pakistan, have started to push back. Is the Belt and Road Initiative an economic cooperation initiative, a stimulus for a slowing Chinese economy, or a new form of economic imperialism through debt trap diplomacy? Is it an answer to Western development efforts led by institutions such as the World Bank that have too often fallen short in the past, or a play for global military and economic influence and dominance by China? Or is the Belt and Road Initiative some combination of these? My personal introduction to this topic came during the summer of 2017 when I was working in Kampala, Uganda as an NYU-sponsored International Law and Human Rights Fellow. Uganda's capital city of Kampala is about 51 kilometers north of the town of Entebbe, home to Uganda's only international airport. Until recently, the drive from Kampala to Entebbe would take about 2 hours on the two-lane Entebbe Highway. In August 2017, as I traveled from Kampala to Entebbe at the end of the summer to fly back here to New York, I watched in amazement from the car window as Chinese and Ugandans worked to expand the highway to 4 lanes. Trucks labeled with China Communications Construction Company lined the roadside. The once 2-hour trip will now take just 30 minutes once construction has been completed. Ugandans will now have a much easier commute between the nation's capital and the nation's airport, thanks to the $350 million project. There is no doubt that the expanded road in itself will have a positive effect on the quality of life of Ugandans. However, the Entebbe Highway construction project was granted to this Chinese state-owned enterprise through a non-competitive bidding process. Some Ugandan leaders are openly concerned that the nation will be crippled by new debt, as China has loaned Uganda nearly $3 billion as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and could potentially lend $2.3 billion more in the near future. What are the long-term costs of projects such as the Entebbe Highway project on the citizens and governments of host nations like Uganda? We are here today to analyze and discuss the dynamics this anecdote represents. I hope that today's discussions will serve to unpack the political, legal, economic, and cultural implications of the changing dynamics of development finance in today's world, as well as identify new questions for future research in areas of scholarship. Today's symposium would not be possible without the generous support over the last 24 years of Mr. Herbert Rubin and the support of his late wife, the Honorable Justice Rose Luton Rubin. JILP is very grateful for the support and commitment of the Rubens, without which we would not be able to do the work we do. In addition, we are grateful for the support of our faculty advisor, Professor Frank Upham, who has actively supported and assisted the development of this symposium since February of this year. Unfortunately, Professor Upham is unable to join us today due to illness. He sends his deepest regrets, and I know we all wish Professor Upham a speedy recovery. I would also like to thank Jerry Holton of NYU Tandon School of Engineering and Dr. Shirtong Chow of the University of Hong Kong for their guidance and advice in the early planning stages. I would like to thank JILP's Editor-in-Chief, Alyssa Wall, for her support and assistance in planning and executing today's symposium. Lastly, I would like to thank our esteemed group of panelists for joining us today for a discussion of this important and timely topic. In planning today's panels, our aim was to bring together academics and practitioners from a variety of perspectives to analyze the complexity of China's emergence as a global development actor. Our first panel today will analyze the current and future implications of China's foreign investment and finance practices. We will examine the meaning of soft power in the Chinese context and whether soft power is a major part of the underlying political rationale behind the Belt and Road Initiative. The panel will also explore the origins, mandate, and operations of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and to what extent it relates to the Belt and Road Initiative. The panel will also analyze the potential impact the Belt and Road Initiative may have on dispute resolution involving foreign investment in China and by China. In the first panel, we will hear a discussion from Professor Jerome Cohen, Natalie Lichtenstein, and Dr. Taizu Zhang. The panel will be moderated by Aaron Halagua of the U.S. Asia Law Institute. The following person probably needs very little introduction, but I'll give it anyway. Professor Jerome Cohen has been a professor at NYU School of Law since 1990 and is the faculty director of its U.S. Asia Law Institute. Professor Cohen introduced the teaching of Asian law into the curriculum of Harvard Law School, where he founded and became initial director of the East Asian Legal Studies program. He is a leading American expert on Chinese law and government and is an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Professor Cohen has published several books on Chinese law and has testified at numerous congressional hearings on China. He retired from the partnership of Paul Weiss in 2000 after over 20 years of law practice focused on China. In his law practice, Professor Cohen represented many companies and individuals in contract negotiations, as well as in dispute resolution concerning China. Natalie Lichtenstein was the inaugural general counsel at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the chief counsel for the bank's establishment from 2014 to 2016. After retiring from a 30-year career at the World Bank, where she focused on lending operations in China and other countries, and institutional governance issues and reforms. Before joining the World Bank, she was an attorney advisor at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, where she worked on issues related to normalization of U.S.-China relations and U.S. participation in international financial institutions. Her recent book, A Comparative Guide to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, was published earlier this year by Oxford University Press. Dr. Taizu Zhang is an associate professor of law at Yale Law School and works on comparative legal history, specifically economic institutions in modern China and early modern Western Europe, comparative law, property law, and contemporary Chinese law. His first book, The Laws and Economics of Confucianism, Kinship and Property in Pre-Industrial China and England, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2017 and recently received the Gaddis Smith Prize from the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies. Prior to Yale Law, Dr. Zhang taught at Duke University School of Law, Brown University, Peking University Law School, the Tsinghua University School of Law, and the University of Hong Kong. Aaron Halagua is a practicing lawyer, independent consultant, and research fellow at NYU Law School's U.S. Asia Law Institute and Center for Labor and Employment Law. He is an expert on labor and employment law, legal aid, grievance mechanisms and dispute resolution, access to justice, human trafficking and forced labor, and corporate social responsibility in the United States, China, and internationally. He is the author of numerous book chapters, articles, and op-eds about labor issues in the United States and China. And he has a forthcoming chapter on labor issues arising in the Belt and Road Initiative. As you can see, the vast experience and expertise of our panelists today will serve to provide a thought-provoking analysis of the increasingly complex topic of China as a global development actor. Please join me in welcoming our speakers for the first panel today.
All right, good afternoon. It's very nice to get an applause before we've even said anything. Hopefully it'll only get better from here. A big thank you to Gracie and Alyssa from JILP and to all of the students and staff who work with that journal for putting on this event. Certainly quite an undertaking, and I hope it'll be a very productive and interesting day. Also a thanks to all the other co-sponsors, to Debevoise, to NYU Africa House, of course to the U.S. Asia Law Institute, which has provided me with a very welcome home for the past several years. And of course to Herbert Rubin and his family for sponsoring this wonderful symposium, who I had the pleasure to have lunch with a few minutes ago and learned about their commitment to these issues. So Gracie gave a very good introduction about the Belt and Road, the sort of cornerstone foreign policy launched by Xi Jinping. And I appreciated her anecdote from Africa of when she first, intersected with that would be the Belt part of it. My own interaction with the Belt and Road, or sort of most intimate one, is both a little closer to home and further from home. Closer in that it took place in Saipan, which is a commonwealth of the United States. And further, because I checked on Google Maps, it does take even longer to get from New York to Saipan than it would to get to Uganda. And this was a case in which there was a Hong Kong invested casino that was building a resort and casino in Saipan, this US Commonwealth. And it was interesting because they had hired several Chinese contractors to actually do the construction. And this included one major SOE, a state-owned enterprise that was sort of a big Chinese-backed company, but also involved private Chinese companies that were traded on the Chinese stock exchange. There was no financing, as far as I could tell, from any development bank or from any Chinese bank of any sort. It also obviously was not an infrastructure project, which we usually think of when we think of the Belt and Road. But nonetheless, when you looked at the websites and the press releases and the promotional materials for each of these Chinese construction companies, they all talked about this as part of their Belt and Road Initiative and their contribution to promoting the Belt and Road. So to me, that raised a couple of interesting questions and gets at least one of the central themes, I think, with the BRI, which is what, if any, are the actual definitions or boundaries of what we're calling the Belt and Road Initiative. And I don't mean this facetiously, but to what extent does it even matter whether it is part of the Belt and Road or is not part of the Belt and Road? So in my own work, looking at labor standards, international labor standards, and how China's investment is affecting this, it really matters very little whether you call the project Belt and Road or it's a Chinese company investing, under some other rubric, and it's not part of the Belt and Road, right? Looking at the impact on the ground seems to have very little to whether or not it is tied to the BRI. And so that's one of the things I'd be curious about when we talk about financial institutions, right? If there are overseas development projects with loans to build infrastructure, does it matter whether or not it's part of the Belt and Road? Or when we're talking about soft power, are we just talking about Chinese, how China is operating in its foreign policy and overseas generally? or does whether or not it's part of the Belt and Road mean something of significance that requires special attention? So I'm going to stop there. I think that's enough from me and want to leave plenty of time for our esteemed panelists. So Gracie has already done a great job of introducing them. So I'm not going to say any more except that I agree with everything she said. And we're going to try to keep it to about 10 minutes for each panelist for their prepared remarks. Professor Cohn has said I can use any means necessary at that point to enforce the time limit.
My cane is over there.
Yeah. And then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. At that point, if you want to line up behind the microphones that are placed in the aisles, we'll just start taking questions from the field. So without further ado, we're not going to go in immediate geographical proximity, but we're going to start with Natalie to talk about her experience and her thoughts on the Belt and Road.
Well, thank you, and I want to thank the organizers and NYU and USALI, but particularly for putting me in this coveted position of being the warm-up act for Jerry Cohen. Many people would pay a high price for that, so thank you. What I'd like to do today is to address the question of the title of this panel, which is the China's foreign investment and finance practices. And like a good lawyer, I will start by telling you what I don't know. So the first question I think you might want to think about is what kind of, quote, Chinese finance, unquote, will be involved in the Belt and Road Initiative. First, as Aaron has already said, there isn't really, I think, a good definition of what is included in the Belt and Road Initiative, although there is a lot of publicity in many different places about what it is. It clearly means infrastructure financing and policy coordination and other connectivity. But it's also not clear to me if BRI means only Chinese financed projects. I don't think it does, but I couldn't point you to a footnoted source for that. As an aside, and as a Washington lawyer, I confess, I want to say I think there's also a bureaucratic dimension of why we can't tell what's in the Belt and Road, because it is the newest thing, certainly in Chinese policy circles, among many new things. And you see every institution setting up a BRI degree program or a this or that. So, you know, I've worked in a lot of bureaucracies, and there's more funding when you're doing the latest thing, and, you know, there's a lot more activity. So I think that will be a gauze or a cover or something over figuring out, well, what exactly is BRI, because I think there are a lot of external advantages to saying this is related to BRI. Overall, I've read a number of studies in preparation for this, since I actually hadn't worked on BRI. AIB is quite different. And here I think the conclusion so far is that Chinese development finance doesn't really seem to be driven by BRI. But I think that many people would say that's also a question of time, because BRI was announced in 2013, and it takes a long time for large infrastructure projects to be prepared and put into place. So, you know, keep watching the many different think tank websites that will give you a rundown of what's in the BRI and what isn't. And I'm not sure what definitions they'll use. What I think of as Chinese finance has two main categories, and first would be outward direct investment, which is you've referred to in the title, and Chinese development finance, that is finance that's coming directly from the Chinese government for promotion of economic development. Outward direct investment, ODI, is Chinese state and private enterprises establishing, purchasing, investing in enterprises and projects outside China. And so far, I think that's not been the main focus of these discussions. Chinese development finance primarily comes through two very large Chinese banks. One is the China Development Bank, and the other is the Chinese Export-Import Bank. And again, I've seen studies that say so far there's no particular geographic pattern to China's development finance. But looking at what their practices are, I think you can find both criticism and also hope for the practices of the China Development Bank. In Chexim, they are under some pressure from the outside to adopt lending practices, project practices that are more like those of other development institutions. But I will leave it to you to do the research, and if your students to write the notes that analyze whether that in fact has happened. There's also something called the Silk Road Fund, just so you're not, in case you're not confused enough, which, as far as I know, is a entirely Chinese financed development institution that's under the People's Bank of China. And then just one more layer, in the government reorganization that was announced by the Chinese government in the spring, there is a new international development cooperation agency, and that will sort of oversee all of, in some way, all of the development agencies and bodies in the Chinese government. And I don't know what impact that will have. Maybe others will speculate about that. It does, for me, bring back not so fond memories of something called the International Development Cooperation Agency, IDCA, that was established in the late 1970s in the US, that was supposed to oversee USAID and a few other things. And I was in the US Treasury at the time, and we were fighting pretty hard not to have it cover what we were working on with the multilateral financial institutions. So IDCA's gone and Treasury's still around, so I guess that's good. So as far as multilateral finance, which means not just from China, but from institutions where China is a shareholder, there are a number of ways in which they're related to the Belt and Road Initiative. So first, there are the multilateral development banks you will have heard of. I mean the World Bank and the regional development banks like the Asian Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the European Investment Bank, the New Development Bank. All of these banks are generally supportive of the Belt and Road Initiative and have signed the Memorandum of Understanding with the Chinese Ministry of Finance to help with projects. If you look on their websites, they've said other things about how they might cooperate. So then we come to the question of AIIB, that is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and I do know something about that. AIIB is not a Chinese bank. It is a multilateral development institution, an international organization, very similarly structured to the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the others. The reason why people think of it as a Chinese bank perhaps is twofold. One is because China led the efforts to get it established. And in fact, Chinese President Xi Jinping first mentioned the Chinese proposal to set up an Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in the same speech to the Indonesian Parliament in October of 2013, where he mentioned the Maritime Silk Road. He had earlier mentioned the Belt in Kazakhstan, I believe. So AIIB and OBOR, which is now called BRI, certainly were brought to fruition in the same period. What's really interesting is if you look back, both of these are ideas that have been around for quite a while. I now found that the idea of an Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank has been around since the early 2000s as part of the thinking in Asia about how to go forward from the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s. And there's some wonderful monographs that talk about the predecessors to Belt and Road and what other kinds of institutions there have been. So again, as a bureaucrat, I have this sense of a new administration in China, like new administrations in many places, looking at ideas that have been kicked around for a while and say, are some of these going to serve our current purposes? I have absolutely no facts, conversations, or anything else for that. It just feels like that to me from my experience. So AIIB is now set up as a development bank, same as the others that I've mentioned. China has 26% of the voting power, which is why people think of it as a Chinese bank. The US had about 35% of the voting power in the World Bank in 1946 when it started operations, and 42% of the Inter-American Bank. And those may well have been thought of as US-driven institutions for many reasons, but they weren't ever thought of as US banks, I think. It might have been good for the World Bank when it started borrowing if people thought it was a US bank, but they had to make it on their own. So why does that matter for finance practices? Because AIB has a set of both a mandate and project practices that are pretty comparable with the other institutions. They're focused on economic decisions, risk assessment, environmental and social aspects, open procurement, which means anybody can participate, from any nationality can participate, transparency, they have anti-corruption policies, and they do have a reference to debt sustainability. And thus far, AIB has approved about 31 operations, a little over $6 billion in commitments. There's a range of countries that are not all in the Belt and Road. In fact, 30% by amount of their approved projects to date have gone to India, which has rather famously not wanted to participate in the Belt and Road. So I mention this because the 70% of AIB's projects to date have been co-financed with the others, which means they each take a piece of the same contracts or the same project. They have to have compatible policies in order to do that. It doesn't work otherwise. So as a World Bank vice president said, of course their policies have to be compatible with ours, or we wouldn't have done all of these co-financed projects. It doesn't mean that there aren't problems. It just means that the policies are similar. And I contrast that with what I called earlier Chinese finance, because I think the Chinese development finance institutions, China Development Bank and China Exim, do not have the same kinds of policies. So lastly, what are the implications for the US? The US did not join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and rather vociferously objected to it at various points in time. Japan has also not joined the AIB. I don't think the US was likely to have joined then because it requires congressional action for the money and for the treaty. And I didn't think that was terribly likely in 2014 and 2015, and I don't see that it would be particularly likely in the coming years. It would also mean that the US would join an institution where they were not the largest shareholder, and that is a rare occurrence. I think our keynote speaker knows more about that than I do. And so it might be salutary for the US to do that, but it would require jumping that hurdle. Japan maybe will join someday. But that's not to say that there hasn't been some impact on the US in terms of BRI or less so AIB. And the US did announce a $113 million fund for infrastructure financing in the Indo-Pacific this summer. That's $113 million. AIB's capital is $100 billion. So there's a bit of a gap there if you were looking competitively. And most recently, Congress approved and the president has signed legislation to create an International Development Finance Corporation that will expand the current Overseas Private Investment Corporation to about 60 billion. And I'm not sure exactly how that will play into this, but clearly that seems to be part of the US reaction as well. If I have 2 more minutes, I just want to close with a positive example.
1.5.
Okay. Well, you just took some of it. So I ended up negotiating the charter for AIB and a few other wonderful things that you never think you'll get to do in law school. And at the first negotiation, I sat at one of the dinners with the Bangladeshi representative, and he said, you know why we're interested in this? We have a deep water port, I don't remember which one, and we really only need about 10% of the capacity. But we are, I think, 700 or 900 kilometers from Kunming. And Kunming is 2,100 kilometers from Shanghai. So if we can make it attractive for Kunming goods to be shipped, whether you do rail or road or boats, to Bangladesh, then they'll take some of the throughput. And there are 6 landlocked provinces of India that also need a port. And if we can get them to take part of it, that'll be it. And what struck me was that as an economic planner, he was looking across the borders. It's very reminiscent to me of learning more about European integration, where the things that were heavy black lines on a map when I went to school are getting thinner and thinner when you're looking at economic opportunities. And so there are lots of problems with interconnectivity and terms of finance. But if you say, at heart, what is this doing, I think there's a potential for a lot of positive.
Great.
So I'm going to exercise just a little bit of moderator prerogative. And, so Natalie, you've given us a lot of data and reasons why this is not a exclusively Chinese effort, sort of not just part of the BRI. In a world where there is a World Bank, there is an Asian Development Bank, what did you see in your sense of what is the big driver, or was the big driver for China to kind of push this initiative? Is it more about soft power and sort of that
You mean BRI?
No, AI,
Okay,
the
because
bank.
BRI, I really don't know what the
Yeah.
China motives were. And honestly, for AIB, as I say, I was a good lawyer, never asked. But I think even if I'd asked, I wouldn't have heard the story. I think part of it was China's view of the importance of infrastructure for China's development and wanting to promote infrastructure development in connectivity in other countries. I think part of it was China's frustration, as well as that of other developing countries, both with their voice in other multilateral development banks, but also with the slowness and the burdensome nature of decision-making processes in the other institutions. I'm sure that there are more interesting questions about why did the other 56 countries come in? And that indeed is part of the question that comes down to BRI as well, because AIB started out as mostly Southeast Asian countries, and then suddenly within 4 months, just before we finished negotiations, we had 57, and that included not only the Middle East of Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Oman, but eventually Australia, Korea, and most of Europe. And so part of the interesting question is, why did these countries come in?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you for that. Even though I disagree with the characterization, what was a self-proclaimed warm-up act for Professor Cohen. So the floor is yours, and I will give a gentle nudge at 10 minutes and see where we go from there.
That's realism. I want to say it was an immense tribute to Natalie Lichtenstein that when AIIB was being established, she was asked by the Chinese, despite the American government's opposition to AIIB, and despite the fact she's an American citizen, she was asked to be the first general counsel and draw up the relevant documentation. That's a huge tribute. Wise move on China's part, because they were trying to show the world they were serious. This would be an international bank, not a Chinese bank. So I was very happy to see that. I want to say that I'm grateful to the Rubin family. I had the first opportunity to meet Mr. Rubin at lunch. Just before we started, Professor Taizu Zhang from Yale said this was the first event that he and I have attended where I was not the oldest person in the room. And I told Mr. Rubin, I want to be like him when I grow up. I'm also, of course, delighted that our U.S. Asia Law Institute could co-sponsor this event with the other distinguished sponsors. Xi Jinping is a high roller. The world is waiting to see how he develops policies on a number of controversial matters that divide the United States and China in an increasingly serious way. And whether we talk about the South China Sea or the terrible repression of the Muslim Turkish people in Xinjiang area of China, he's pressing the envelope in many ways, a much stricter policy in freedom of speech, and arbitrary detention is prevailing to a greater extent. But maybe BRI is his greatest roll of the dice. It's not clear what's going to happen. Whether we call it OBOR or BRI, it's a high-risk proposition politically, economically. Will China be overextended? Will it produce more harm in its relations with the countries it's attempting to befriend or not? We don't yet know. And that's sort of the background. This isn't, of course, the first time China has been investing overseas. BRI is a few years old, actually, and we've had many Chinese investments before that in Africa and elsewhere. These things don't just suddenly spring out of the head of Zeus or even Xi Jinping. And I thought today I'd give a little bit of historical background on dispute resolution. It's obvious that there already have been a number of disputes through so-called BRI projects. Some of them in countries that didn't realize until recently they were involved in BRI. It's a little bit like the boy who discovers he's been writing prose all his life. And all of a sudden, some countries are like, wow, we too are BRI. But some of them haven't liked the terms. And when political shifts have taken place in those countries, Malaysia is one of the leading examples recently, we've seen attempts to renegotiate. That kind of dispute resolution is really government to government. We're talking about three kinds of disputes: ordinary commercial disputes that aren't only commercial because they often involve important agencies of the Chinese government that have set up so-called commercial independent enterprises. We also have investor-state disputes, and I see my distinguished friend Ko Yong Tung there in the audience, used to be Vice President and General Counsel of the World Bank, and I hope later we can get him into the discussion, because I don't know much about investor-state disputes, and he does. He's teaching it now at Harvard. He's taught at this university, law school, and Yale and other places. I'm going to deal with the commercial disputes, and I've been involved with that from the beginning. But I should say, when I say beginning, I mean China's relations with the Western powers after the process of normalization was initiated by the famous Nixon visit to China in February '72. At that time, China was not prepared to handle international commercial disputes except with the Soviet bloc. China had, beginning the mid-50s, a foreign trade arbitration institution that dealt with ordinary trade matters, disputes among Soviet-dominated countries. So in the 70s, it wasn't clear how China would cope with the sudden interest of foreign investors. I remember going to the Canton Trade Fair in 1973 and sitting in the bar on the 8th floor of the Dongfang Hotel night after night, talking to the European commercial counselors who'd been trying to settle disputes with China for the previous years as China emerged, despite the Cultural Revolution, into the international business realm. And one after another, they told me these stories of trying to invoke the arbitration clause in a business contract with a Chinese entity and being told, arbitration is a very unfriendly act. And if you want to go to arbitration, don't anticipate doing much further business with us. They always preferred to try to settle things informally, preferably in the next dispute negotiation, where they could pay off a debt without suffering the embarrassment of losing face by a recognition that they had failed to honor a previous contract. So China had to, by 1979, as Deng Xiaoping took over and the open policy began, China had to deal with settling disputes in a better way than they had. At first, I negotiated a number of contracts in 79, 80, 81. It was difficult. Chinese associates across the table did not want to recognize that we should provide for disputes. We got some support when the joint venture law, among the first Chinese laws in a long time, came out on July 1, 1979. It was my birthday, so I remember it well. We talked about negotiating what happens if our contract fails in some way, if one party claims the other has violated it. It was only when the joint venture law had some brief reference to using arbitration as a preferred way of settling disputes that it was even legitimate to discuss these things in contract negotiations. And it was only after the joint venture regulations interpreted the vague law that had come out 4 years earlier that we began to get serious foreign investment in China. And here, one of the first questions to be confronted, and it relates to today, was when a foreign company wants to invest in China, can it solve its disputes with the local partner outside of China, or must all disputes be solved within China? I represented one of the major oil companies at that time, and they were determined they could not go into China and have disputes settled within China. On the basis of their experience in other developing countries, they decided it had to be in some neutral venue, if not in the United States or their other home place. And yet China insisted, beginning the mid-'80s, you want to invest in China, you gotta solve your investment dispute in China. They didn't make the same demand with respect to other contracts, commercial contracts, buying and selling, loan agreements, etc. There was always the usual bargaining over how would a dispute be settled, what would the institution be, what would its procedures be, what language should govern, what would be the governing law, etc. The usual questions that come up in dispute resolution. But China was clear, you want to invest in our country, settle your dispute in our country. And that made for some very awkward decision-making where bargaining power, lust for the China market often made the difference. And what we found was some companies would accept and some companies would not. But often a really major dispute never got to arbitration. There was no interest in the Chinese courts at all. There was fear. Courts were unknown, and people just wanted to settle disputes outside of the courts. Mediation was always a possibility and had to be provided for, but people knew it was arbitration if you came to really solving the dispute in the legal way. I worked on many dispute resolution things and tried to avoid arbitration. Often you'd go into the relevant foreign investment department of the province involved, and you'd lay down the contract and you'd lay down the law, Chinese law, and you'd tell them about facts that you thought established a violation of the contract. And usually in the 80s that worked. In the 90s that didn't work anymore. The Chinese investment authorities would say, now we have dispute resolution, you must go to arbitration or whatever. And I would say, well, 2 years from now, I'll come back, my client having spent $200,000 on the arbitration, and we still will need your help in enforcing the award. But we see even today, many of these disputes, as in the Malaysian case, they don't get to the legal dispute resolution level. They will be resolved in more political, economic, bigger terms. But nevertheless, you have to have the arrangements for settling dispute one way or another. Well, China has developed better institutions since 1979. The China International Economic and Trade Arbitration Commission, CETAC, at one point was the busiest international arbitration tribunal in the world. Now I see more of its cases are said to be local Chinese cases than international. because there's immense competition in this field. China has over 200 local arbitration commissions that are authorized to settle international disputes. There's immense competition. The best of them is the Beijing Arbitration Commission, which from my experience is much better than CTAC. I used to be quite favorable to CTAC. In the mid-'80s, I was the first foreign lawyer to appear before them. The three arbitrators made a good impression, and I remember as I was arguing the case thinking, if three arbitrators can give me such a good impression, why can't three judges? Why can't China produce independent judges who can make a good impression upon foreigners? What happened, however, was I became increasingly disillusioned with Chinese arbitrators. I used to go around and give speeches to business audiences all over, and people would come up to me after it, why did you say such nice things about CTAC? Don't you know? And I began to collect these experiences like butterflies, and gradually saw, and then through my own experience, that CTAC arbitration left too much to be desired. There's too much behind-the-scenes politics. The administrative agency, CTAC, had too much power over the arrangements. You didn't really know what was going on. And I remember in one case where I thought an American power company had just been denied a $38 million claim that it deservedly had. The two Chinese arbitrators, when I said, I'm going to have to write a dissent, they said, please do, but no one will ever see it, because we don't allow dissenting opinions or negative votes to be broadcast to people. Even the lawyers involved will never see it. Well, that's a terrible rule, I believe, because it means the majority has no restraint. They don't have to be accountable in any way. Well, that's changed. It's an example of CTAC's attempt to compete with the world. They have had rules that don't measure up to some of the better international arbitration institutions that are more independent. And this is one example. Now it's required, if you dissent, not only can you make it known, but you have to write something too. And that's a good rule, because you need reasons for whatever you do. You can't just say, I agree with one side or the other. But despite these changes, CTAC is still in trouble. Trouble domestically as well as internationally. There has been a civil war within Chinese arbitration where Shenzhen and Shanghai branches of CTAC revolted against the central authority. And now we have a separation that's been acknowledged after a long period of uncertainty and difficulty for foreigners. And you have, of course, the local competition, but more important is the competition from Hong Kong and from Singapore. And Hong Kong will be slightly affected by this, I think, because people worry about the Hong Kong courts. To what extent in the future, given Beijing's increasing pressure and restrictions on Hong Kong legally, will you be able to get a continuing independent decision out of Hong Kong arbitration? The Hong Kong International Arbitration Center just put out a press release that it's the nearest thing to advertising I've seen a British legal authority engage in, and it's not in that tradition. But they were clearly showing we can still compete with Singapore. And then, of course, you have other institutions that have been with us a long time, including International Chamber of Commerce, with which I've done a lot. But you also have Dubai. Later today, you'll hear from Professor Matthew Erie, who knows about the Dubai institution for settling disputes. And so there's a kind of 100 flowers development. All these arbitration institutions are hungering for some of the business, and they have to compete. And I think competition is good, and it's going to benefit China also. So when you look at what we're facing, in the most recent institutional development is the International Commercial Court that has been set up in China. Natalie knows about that. Some of us have been trying to follow it. Professor Uri has been following it. This is just an 8-judge court that is based now in Shenzhen and also in, what is it, where are they? Xi'an, thanks. And it's going to be eventually in Beijing. I don't know if it'll get much business. Why would anyone in Pakistan or Malaysia or Indonesia want to solve a dispute before a Chinese court for an investment project in their country? It's contrary to what the Chinese insisted upon, as I said at the outset. And if China insists on that, it'll make it like China is practicing the kind of reciprocity that it's already been occasionally criticized for. Years ago, a French diplomat said the Chinese idea of reciprocity is, I demand freedom from you in the name of your principles. I deny it to you in the name of mine. So can China at once say, investors who come to China must solve their disputes in China, but when we go to Indonesia, the dispute must also be resolved in China? I don't think it's going to get too far. And although the international commercial court that's been set up has some very impressive judges, they'll be training some younger people, I think, who are good. They're going to try to incorporate mediation and arbitration into the judicial process. This is an innovation. I think BRI is a spur to legal innovation in China, but I'm not confident at all it will lead to China getting the majority of the opportunities for settling international business disputes.
So that triggers a lot of potential questions in my head, but staying disciplined, we're going to move on to our third panelist, Professor Zhang, and I'm going to make a small recommendation because I think it relates quite poignantly to your topic, which is we talked a little bit about the One Belt, One Road and how it became the Belt and Road Initiative. And my understanding is it has something to do with the words that were actually being used in Chinese. And originally the One Belt, One Road, I think, was referred to as a strategy of sorts. And that was perceived as perhaps being a little too reminiscent of perhaps a military or other. We can give you a different microphone. So that they decided to go with Belt and Road Initiative because initiative sounded softer, which plays into this idea of, what is the perception of Belt and Road? What is it trying to achieve? How do others view it? So if you know anything about that, feel free to chime in. If not, proceed with your prepared remarks.
Sure, can I borrow one?
Yeah.
Because this one's not working.
This one did work, so let's see.
All right, thank you. So let me join the chorus in thanking the organizers and the Rubin family for sponsoring this. Natalie had the, great job of setting up Jericho, and I have the much less enviable job of actually being the follow-up act. So when I told my wife last night, I had to explain to her why I would not be picking up the kids today. That this is what I would be doing. She basically looked at me as if I were going completely insane. And then later remarked that this must have been the peak of my personal intellectual hubris. Because in her mind, and frankly in mine as well, I don't really, I'm not a BRI expert, I'm not a Chinese foreign relations expert. If you were interested in, for example, the history of the Silk Road and why the Silk Road doesn't really matter as much in global history as people think it does, I could give you a long history of that, but I suppose no one here actually is coming here for that kind of thing. That said, I took the invitation largely because soft power, the entire notion of Chinese soft power, comes quite close to a bit of my own my own research interests. Insofar as, to me, soft power really is about kind of an ideological balancing act. It's about the management and creation of perceptions and of kind of mental leaps in between actual empirical facts. It has much to do with my general research on culture and ideology in the Chinese political and legal context. So for the most part, that's what I'm going to try to talk about today, and I will limit myself to 10 minutes or perhaps maybe 1 or 2 minutes more than that. Now, the overall concept of soft power, as Joseph Nye initially threw it out, and then as has been developed over the past 2 decades, basically is supposedly the ability to persuade and attract as opposed to the ability to coerce and perhaps buy people off. Right? And instead of interacting with other countries in kind of like a materialistic fashion through either military force or economic force, you're basically making them agree with your viewpoint through persuasion and intellectual or perhaps cultural / political / ideological attraction. Now, for the most part, the vast majority of the time when people talk about soft power, the discussion is grounded in a overall discussion towards things like likability, like how likable a society is perceived, like how do you win over hearts and minds, how do you make people see you as a friend, see you as having shared values, shared bottom lines, and so on and so forth. Basically, it's about the generation of kind of like warm and fuzzy feelings, and that you want other countries to see you as both a friend and also perhaps as normatively good. You want to be seen as the good guys who come in flying at the last minute to shoot the bad guys or something like that. Now, that said, to me, there's always been kind of like an underappreciated dimension of what soft power actually is, and this is the dimension that especially is pertinent in both the usual Chinese political context and the BRI context, which is really that, to a very large extent, soft power is not about like fuzzy and warm likability feelings at all. It's about the generation of perceptions of competence and perceptions of like strategic ambition. The underlying behavioral theory in all of this is that, like virtually everything in politics, diplomacy and foreign policy, especially in this day and age when it's increasingly becoming concentrated in the hands of people in Washington and people elsewhere that we would not necessarily consider foreign policy professionals or highly trained or highly, temperamentally mellow people. Foreign policy is, like anything else in politics, often conducted on the basis of both, one, incomplete information, and second, all kinds of weird cognitive biases. Right? It's a decision-making process that, yes, is based in some ways on empirical data, but at the same time, the way that you process that empirical data involves a lot of hunches, a lot of logical leaps, a lot of cognitive biases, a lot of framing effects, and so on and so forth. And so, this is something that virtually every sophisticated international actor obviously knows, and hence, if you're truly sophisticated, you should also be in the business of trying to actively shape other countries' perceptions of your capacity as opposed to simply trying to kind of like beef up your capacities. Beefing up your capacities is one thing, but then at the same level, there's a somewhat separate dimension of trying to massage international perceptions of how powerful you are, how competent you are, how strategically coherent you are, and so on and so forth. And if you think about soft power, why is there a separate category called soft power in global relations, and why does it make sense to us? It's because intuitively we know that hard power itself, just your material economic capacity, does not always immediately translate into fully rationalized, fully specific and exact responses by international parties. And that there's always going to be something of the sort of, acting on hunches, acting on whether I trust this guy, acting on, like I look deeply into the guy's eyes and see his soul kind of thing that, especially in the recent American political arena, seems to be on the rise. So this is the kind of thing that I think in many ways the BRI as an actual concentrated initiative is trying to actually accomplish. Because if you think about it, right, like people often talk about Chinese soft power initiatives over the past decade in the sense that China is trying to raise its international stature, it's trying to make other countries like it more, attach more legitimacy to the Chinese political model. It's trying to make people think that there's China's offering an ideological alternative to the Washington Consensus or to the American liberal democratic model, and so on and so forth. Now, and the BRI, likewise, is also often seen as a way for China to kind of like sell its own model, sell its own political and economic model to other countries, try to get it kind of like make other countries like it more, feel more friendly towards China, and so on and so forth. Now, if that is actually the goal, then I think we can all kind of agree just by reading the news every day that China seems to be doing a really bad job of that. In the sense that like over the past 2 or 3 years, China has also, at the same time that it's been pushing the BRI, engaged in an enormous amount of activities. For example, almost unnecessarily pushing the South China Sea disputes, becoming more belligerent, becoming a little bit more obviously expansionist, trapping other countries in dead traps, and then taking over their ports and so on and so forth, that clearly don't quite seem to work if the goal is to make everyone else like China a lot. Increasingly, I don't think it would necessarily be that much of an exaggeration to say that the international perception of the BRI is not terribly popular. Well, it's a huge thing. Everyone talks about it all the time, but it's rarely perceived by even countries on the receiving end of Chinese loans as being something akin to the Marshall Plan. Like it's not an exercise of goodwill. It's not an exercise of camaraderie, of friendship, of shared ideological goals, of like a global vision or so on and so forth. Everyone just basically seems to think that it's a Machiavellian Chinese program designed to basically extend Chinese influence across the globe. If that's true, then that's the complete opposite of what you would want to achieve in the conventional soft power context. And of course, certainly at the same time, if you look at the overall legacy of perhaps soon to be past legacy of Confucius Institutes and other forms of Chinese soft power initiatives over the past decade, I think it's probably fair to say, especially in the Western world, it's been a miserable failure all around. And certainly I don't see any indication that Americans like China anymore because of all the Confucius Institutes in the US. Much more likely it's actually been the opposite. Now, there may very well have been some kind of miscalculation on the Chinese government's behalf in that, but at least on the likability front, I think the policymakers in Beijing have to have recognized by this point that none of these things are necessarily making China seem that much more likable in the global context. What does make China seem more likable on the global context is, for example, Donald Trump. And the chaos he creates in the international context that makes European countries, for example, flock to Xi Jinping a little bit more. And at Davos and other international forums, somehow for a very brief period, Xi Jinping was heralded as the next champion of globalism, of international trade and the international order. That all, of course, died out once he became essentially our ruler for life. This March, once he passed the constitutional amendments that removed term limits to the presidency. I think virtually all of the goodwill that previously was given to China simply by virtue of Trump destroying it on the US's part evaporated, not quite overnight, but very fast. And I think, honestly, the guys in Beijing who are calling the shots know all of this, in that they're not so naive as to think the BRI will actually increase China's likability or favorability ratings. Like a few days ago, there was a survey of a large share of Asian countries. China's favorability ratings was something like the 20s. It was actually considerably lower than what it had been a few years ago because Asian countries were enormously wary of China's perceived expansion and so on and so forth. So I don't think anyone in Beijing is under any illusion that the BRI is going to make China more likable. They know it's very likely actually having the opposite effect. But that doesn't mean that the BRI is not a soft power play, because I think what the BRI is actually trying to create is it's trying to enhance an international perception of Chinese economics plus political plus strategic coherence and capacity. And that, I think, especially to the Chinese domestic policy circle, is actually a better, more secure way to gain soft power over the long run than actually just trying to boost your favorability ratings. And it's in this kind of context that the presentation of the BRI as a centralized, coherent initiative begins to matter a huge amount. Because, as Natalie and Jerry and Aaron were pointing out beforehand, the BRI actually involves not nearly as many new projects as we commonly perceive it to actually involve. A lot, arguably most of the things going on as part of the BRI framework on the ground were actually well under progress before the BRI was actually announced. And so the BRI really is kind of like this ex post attempt to give organizational shape and cohesion to a set of initiatives that actually had already begun well before the BRI was announced. So, but that said, the presentation of the BRI as some kind of Chinese grand strategy does, it's clear in many ways, even in the fact that we're currently having this entire symposium at NYU about this thing, right? China was investing in Africa and Central Asia for quite a long time before the actual announcement of BRI, but it didn't grab headlines, didn't grab attention nearly as much as the BRI currently has managed to do, and that in many ways is precisely the intended effect. It's to generate the notion that China has a cohesive, well-planned out grand strategy for raising its international profile and expanding globally. right? And so, especially when you consider the fact that a lot of these things, a lot of the actual projects were underway well before the initiative's announcement, then you could actually say that the announcement of this full-blown initiative in the initiative form, in the form of the BRI, right, is it's actually predominantly a soft power play because all of the hard power stuff, all of the actual investment, all of the economic interactions and the political interactions, for the most part, are continuous before and after the BRI. There's no sudden leap in Chinese foreign investment after the BRI. There's no sudden leap in Chinese regional or global interventionism after the BRI. What's leaped and become discontinuous is basically the international perception of how cohesive, how well planned, how strong the Chinese will is behind this initiative. And that creates this kind of like international perception of expansionary Chinese grand strategy, and that in the end matters a lot because for especially these medium and small sized countries who are interacting with China, the perception that China is on its way towards raising its global profile, becoming a major global player, demanding that it have a seat at virtually every table in the international arena, that creates a certain kind of mindset that makes these countries much more likely to give China a wider berth of deference, and also makes it more likely that when they think of possible partners and cooperating parties for any kind of domestic initiative, they think of China that much more often. And plus, at the same time, it seems possibly to make the overall international perception of Chinese economic capacity, technological prowess, and so on and so forth, even perhaps very arguably higher than it actually is. Like one of the striking things of teaching in the U.S. as a Chinese citizen is honestly, like the U.S. seems to have a vastly, vastly higher perception of China's technological prowess and the level of Chinese technological advancement and so on and so forth than what you actually see and hear people discuss in China. We have a much more pessimistic view of our development than, frankly, most American policymakers seem to have of us. And in many ways, that's the kind of thing that this BRI project and things like, say, the Made in China 2025 initiative are trying to basically facilitate. They want to create an international perception of hard power that perhaps goes beyond the actual hard power that China currently commands. And that's why that kind of perception falls more neatly into the category of soft power instead of hard power. Now, the counterargument, of course, is that this kind of behavior likely leads to alarmism in China's true international competitors, like, say, the U.S. and perhaps Japan. In major power or great power relations, this kind of enhancement of international perceptions of Chinese capacity actually is a detriment because it makes the other major powers take China perhaps even more seriously than they should and begin to target and try to act against China in coordinated fashions. I suppose the notion and the thinking in Beijing is that was going to happen anyway, that at some point the Chinese economy simply became too large, and given that the U.S. political sphere, the U.S. political arena has a way of creating artificial kind of like others to compete against. The Japanese in the 1980s were like a punching bag for American domestic foreign policy in many ways, for American domestic policy in many ways. The thinking was that the Americans were going to go after us anyway, right? So even if we make them feel more alarmed than perhaps they have justifiable hard power reasons to feel, that won't add too much to the broader trend of U.S.-China relations. What we really care about is making everyone else in the world, these smaller, medium-sized countries who are on the fence about choosing global partners or global patrons and so on and so forth, we want to make them think that we are the rising power, we are internationally expansionist, we are hugely powerful, well thought out. Unlike the chaotic U.S. foreign policy, we have a coherent grand strategy that is long-term, that is patient, that is backed up by huge amounts of domestic political will, and that makes us more attractive, regardless of whether they like us or not. As an international partner, it makes us indispensable for these countries to, it makes it impossible for anyone to deal internationally and not think of us as somebody that you actually have to manage around. And that perhaps is, I think, what a lot of us is actually getting at. It's the generation of this overwhelming perception of capacity that's actually underlying in what sense the BRI actually is a soft power play. So.
All right. So thank you, Professor Zheng. And just to echo, I have a in terms of this sort of what are the statistics about the perception of China overseas, the Pew Research Center just came out with a new study, I think, in the past week. Interestingly, has two numbers. The first is, the question is whether you would prefer the United States or, would the world be better for the world to have the US or China as the leading global power? And so when they looked at 25 countries, including countries in Europe and around the world, 63% said that they prefer the US and 19% said they prefer China. In terms of looking at just countries in Asia, 73% of Asian respondents preferred the United States and 12% preferred China. I can't speak to the methodology or the p-value of any of these things, but just an interesting statistic to put out there. So if we have questions, I'm going to ask for people to line up at the microphones because I believe it is being recorded, and so even if we can hear you, for it to be your question to be preserved eternally, we need you to speak into one of the microphones. While people line up, I have one question. I mean, it would be such a shame if we only relied on or made use of Professor Cohen's knowledge about dispute resolution and not the sort of broader international political context. And I'm curious, as you see it, knowing a lot and working in U.S. foreign policy over the decades, the conversations you have with Chinese leaders, what are your thoughts in terms of, what did or does the United States want in Asia in terms of its strategic goals? And are there any meaningful or significant differences in terms of China and what it wants as its a rising power to achieve in Asia? Are all countries just trying to the best of their ability to, protect their businesses, promote their commercial interests, secure their security as much as possible? In what ways is what China is doing meaningfully different in any way from what the U.S. has always been trying to do in the world?
Well, the U.S. has wanted to be the dominant power in East Asia, and that's being challenged by China. China would like us to be content with what we've done in the Caribbean and in the Latin America, et cetera, as our bailiwick. And I think they would like to have a more traditional situation where they will become, once again, as they were in the past, the dominant power in East Asia. And that's a general motivation. I think that's at least the minimal Chinese dream that Xi Jinping has expressed. Some people interpret some of his statements more broadly, that China really wants to be the dominant power in the world. There are many influential people in China who do not think China is remotely ready for that, and it's not even clear what the cost will be of Chinese continuing effort to be the dominant power in East Asia. These figures, the Pew results you just cited, show that most countries don't want China to dominate their region. They don't really want the United States to dominate them either. They'd like to have independence, play off one side against the other. And you tend to fear the major power who's closer to you than you do the major power who's further away. And even under Trump and all his misguided, fearsome policies, people still think over the years Trump will be gone, the United States will reassert its previous attempts at leadership, and that they'll try to restrict China's progress. But they're careful of China. China, as the Chinese leaders remind the East Asian countries, China is a big power, and even Japan has to take account of that. So there's a balancing exercise of continuing tension, feelers, etc. I think solutions will be found over time to getting along better. It's hard to reverse what China has done in the South China Sea. I think they're unlikely to go further. East China Sea is likely to remain sort of the way it is. I think we'll work out gradually a modus vivendi with North Korea that will remove the threat of crisis we felt so acutely last year. But what worries me the most in our relations with China is what they're doing in Xinjiang, detaining perhaps 1 million people in what are evidently increasingly recognized as prisons without any due process. This is gradually going to arouse the world, and even the Muslim governments that have been reluctant to speak out on behalf of their brothers in China are beginning to feel under pressure at home, and I don't see where this is going to stop. I think Xi Jinping is on a course that he's not going to want to retreat from, and while this doesn't have the drama of an assassination in a consulate that we've just witnessed in Saudi Arabia's relations with Turkey, I think people are increasingly abroad going to say, talk about soft power, look at what China has done. So I'm hoping in various relations with China, many people will point out this is a misguided path, and we should worry about trade and business. We can find solutions once Trump is behind us to trade and business with China. There are too much mutually advantageous relationships involved here to let this go down the drain.
Any questions from the floor? Professor Tung, you're going to be on deck for the next question because you've already been singled out by Professor Cohn, but I'll ask one in the intervening moment. We have 2 questions. I mean, I had one question for Natalie just about, so, in the popular press, and I'm not going to claim to know the, actual specific facts because maybe they're somewhat misrepresented, but we've been reading a lot about, for instance, like the Sri Lanka case where, an investment is made for a large infrastructure project. It was sort of known from the outset, as it's portrayed, that they didn't really need this project, and then that they wouldn't be able to repay it, and this whole sort of debt trap policy, and then China was able to get a 99-year lease to this strategic port. I'm just curious in your reflections sort of on that. Do you have a sense, is that an accurate description of what goes on? How is that very different from what would happen in lending in one of these multilateral banks?
So I know 0 about the details of the Sri Lankan case. I probably have read some of the same articles you have, maybe not as many. So I don't know really how to differentiate that from if it had been a World Bank or IFC financed project. It probably wouldn't have had a 99-year lease, but it would have had some kind of security. And if you're the lender and you have some security in case your loan doesn't get paid, you usually do exercise your rights to the security. Whether that was the right backup in that transaction or whether it was there because of an unequal relationship, I don't know. But it did strike me that on the one hand, I've read a lot of criticism of Chinese development bank loans being basically bilateral aid and not driven by economics. And so it does seem to me odd that when you actually have what appears to be an economically driven provision, if you don't exercise it, it looks to me like politics. But as I say, I don't know what the facts of that case are and whether in fact that's normal. I did read somewhere where China has interests in 30 equity interests in like 30 ports around the world. So there's a lot more to be seen on that side of it, I think.
Yeah. Okay, why don't we start with our right. If you could say your name and your affiliation, and although it seems to always need to be said, to limit it to a question as opposed to a comment, and only one question.
Hi, my name is Eva Idlin Moranji, and actually my question relates to what you were just talking about. I'm currently a fellow with PILNET, the Global Network for Public Interest Law, and I am actually from Uganda, so Grace gave a very good example of, hi, yes. So it's a toll road. We now have to pay like 5,000 shillings for it, which is around $1.5. And yes, it used to take 2 hours on a good day to go to the airport. On a realistic day, maybe 3 to 4 hours. And now it takes 30 minutes. But my question relates more to what Natalie has been talking about, which are there any measures maybe by the international financial institutions like the IMF or the FSB on how these Chinese investments are currently done especially in African states in relation to debt and the security that is being taken on by these countries? As you have heard, I think China, it's a dispute, some are saying it's not true or it's true, has taken over airports in Zambia and maybe the national power utility in Zambia, ZESCO. So such instances where the Chinese, after these investments have gone wrong because of debt and maybe the loans have been unpaid, is there a framework of how the investments are being controlled? Is there an international framework or is it strictly domestic? And what trends or future do you hope for to ensure that the environment is more enabling? Thank you.
So I'm going to ask you to hang for a second. Maybe we'll take a few questions and then answer them together. And Professor Cohn pointed out we do also have an expert from Harvard Law School, Ying Xia, who will be talking in the afternoon about Chinese investment in Africa.
Thank you. I'm Yuichiro Abe. I'm currently study here as international law study students. And I have a similar question related to the Chinese loan. And as far as I'm concerned, there is some articles about the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, which is the Chinese government took the management right of the port. And one solution of the truly beneficial development project is the concept of quality infrastructure, which is prescribed by SDG 19 goal, if I have not made mistake. And under the concept of the quality infrastructure, there is required that the financial soundness of the recipient countries or the resilience of the infrastructure like that. So, which is ensuring the true benefit of the recipient countries. And my question is that whether AIIB and Chinese Development Bank will follow such kind of international standards of the infrastructure development or not in the future. Thank you.
Okay.
Hello, I'm Icarus Chan. I'm from Hong Kong, and I'm a fellow with PILNet, the Global Network for Public Interest Law also. And I have a question for Professor Cohen. But before that, let me briefly introduce. It was very surprising that you addressed the issue of dispute resolution. And I happen to have clerked at the Supreme People's Court in Shenzhen, where the commercial court that you mentioned, and I clerked with one of the judges. So I would be happy to talk about that with you. But today, what brought me here is my organization, which is focused on human rights. So my question to you rather is on the human rights dimension of Belt and Road in the context of dispute resolution. So to give a very brief background of why this question comes up. So in investment, especially under the Belt and Road Initiative, it is foreseeable that there may be some human rights concerns, for example, supply chain, labor rights disputes. And what do you see the human rights implications in the Belt and Road, and how should we manage those risks? Thank you very much.
And let's take one more before we start answering the first round.
Thank you. Hiroko Yamamoto from Harvard Law School. There was a lot of discussion about the BRI being an ex post facto name that is slapped onto infrastructure and other projects. I was curious, especially if I could hear the insights from Ms. Lichtenstein about how AIIB, when they are deciding on lending projects, whether they consider something a BRI project, whether that name comes up in the discussion or not, or whether it's something that governments or press slaps on in the later stages, and whether using that phrase would do any work in the future, you think, in the lending process. Thank you.
Okay, so sorry to those of you who are going to have to stand a little longer, but it's good to keep the blood flowing. So despite your self-proclaimed ignorance about all things BRI, that did not stop the onslaught or flood of questions about BRI investments.
Well, I didn't get this far by making up answers to questions, and I'm not going to start now. So, no, I really know nothing at all about the framework for the kind of international investments you're talking about, or the Financial Stability Board or the IMF, but I do note that there's a very illustrious panel following us, and I hope they'll be able to answer something of your questions. I also, as I said, I don't know anything about the Sri Lankan port project, and I have heard of the Sustainable Development Goals, and I suppose they might be addressed in the next panel. As far as AIB is concerned in its investments, it has, and it's public, you can see the operational policy on financing that has to look at the same economic, technical, and professional assessments that the other multilateral development banks do in terms of deciding whether to make an investment or not, and that includes debt sustainability. I don't know what the China Development Bank practices are. I see criticism of them, but that doesn't mean that I know what they are. As far as AIB and BRI, I would say first, I'm the former general counsel. I helped set up the institution for a year and a half of negotiations, and I served for 6 months as the first general counsel. AIB has a non-resident board of directors, which is unusual but hardly unprecedented for these kinds of institutions. And I've often said that I thought that a non-resident board of directors was a great idea, works for most corporations around the world, but I think that a non-resident general counsel is a terrible idea. And I was commuting from Washington a couple of weeks a month, and then, like most other people around, working 24 hours a day. And if you're the lawyer, you really want to be there, even once you staff up. So, but while I was at AIB, which was through 2016, I never heard any talk of OBOR. It's a little bit like, I'm embarrassed to say that in my 30 years in the World Bank, I never talked about the Washington Consensus. I know there are many other people who spent a lot of time talking about the Washington Consensus. It was only after I retired that people seemed to assume I would know what it was, so I went and read up on it. So thanks to this wonderful symposium, I've now read up on BRI, but I don't think it would make a difference to AIB's decision-making process. It may make a difference. One of the questions is why do the countries want to participate, not just in AIB as an institution, but why do they want AIB to finance a project either in conjunction with another lender or by itself? And I don't know to what extent the choice of which projects go with which institution, whether that may also be influenced by BRI. But as I said, I can't make up answers to questions. It's no fun.
One huge difference is transparency. If you want to know all about how AIIB, the bank, is organized, here's the text Natalie has written. Don't wait to see the movie. We know so little about what we put under this label of BRI. And one of the problems, and this relates to the good question that I got, is corruption. To what extent, I was asked about human rights implications of BRI, and of course, many of these so-called BRI investments are support for dictatorial governments. And what China features is, unlike other international or even national funding institutions, China doesn't ask too many questions about human rights and lets the governments do what they think appropriate, provides funding that helps keep them in office, and often funding that helps secure their financial future because of the importance of kickbacks and other forms of corruption. So this is a very serious problem. Xi Jinping, of course, for over 5 years has been carrying on a very strong campaign against corruption, selectively applied, of course, and to what extent there should be corruption investigations of the arrangements such as those made by China and Malaysia before the new Malaysian government took over. That's really an interesting problem, but a lot of people have gotten very rich in the course of this, and so we shouldn't leave corruption out of this discussion.
Okay, why don't we mix it up and start here and take the next set of 4 questions, and I'm going to ask to keep it to questions after you introduce yourself.
My name is Bing Ling from University of Sydney.
We got to hear you, Bing.
My question is in regard to third-party binding dispute settlement. Jerry, you described China's historical reticence over accepting third-party binding dispute settlement process. In the wake of China's debacle in the South China Sea arbitration, the Chinese government pronounced that it will never accept binding third-party dispute settlement in disputes over its core interest. Now, we do not know whether BRI would lead to any dispute over China's core interest. So my question to you, Jerry, is this BRI initiative, do you consider this to be an occasion that would provide impetus for China's more engagement with third-party binding dispute settlement, or is it more likely to lead to China's expansion of its judicial power, such as the International Commercial Court in the Supreme Court?
This is from Professor Bing Ling of the University of Sydney, one of the world's leading experts on China, international law, and domestic law, who happens to be here this week because his daughter is an LLM student at NYU, and we're exploiting him.
Does that answer your question?
No. He's alluding to China's failure to take part in the Philippine arbitration against China in accordance with the arrangements of UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And many people inside China as well as out were very disappointed by that because China, when it joined UNCLOS, committed itself to a process or several alternative processes for solving disputes about what UNCLOS means. But when the Philippines brought this stunning case against China, instead of taking their arguments that the tribunal had no jurisdiction, for example, to the tribunal, China just showed its back of the hand and said, we're not participating because we're right. And since we're right, we don't need anybody, third-party court or other impartial arbitration institution to vindicate our claim. If you're right, you don't have to go to court. You can just forget it and discredit the arbitrators if you can, and they certainly made an effort to do that, and then try to undermine the award through political economic negotiations. So, and this is only part of a broader problem that worries me. One example, and I see Ms. Yujia Chun in the back with whom I wrote something about this case involving Australia, when Australia and China had a dispute over how to interpret the bilateral convention on consular relations, protecting each other's nationals in the other country. Instead of engaging in interpretation of the agreement as they might have, the Chinese spokesman for the Foreign Affairs Ministry just said, no one can interfere with China's judicial sovereignty, meaning even China can't by making an agreement in the exercise of sovereignty. That means in the future they're free to do whatever they want. And that gets to your core question. China can impose, this is a core interest of ours, on any issue that comes up. And that leaves no room for negotiation. And although Xi Jinping makes some very good speeches trying to appeal to the world that China wants to share everything with all the benefits with the rest of mankind, when it comes to some concrete issues, they seem free to say, this is a core interest, there's not any room for negotiation. You take our position or not. So that's the reality.
Okay, so we're going to try again to take the last 4 questions. So we're going to hold off on responding until we get them all.
Okay, I'm Federico, and I'm an NYU LLM student. And my question relates to the monetary aspects of the financing projects, both from the Chinese investment vehicles and the multilateral ones. So I wanted to know in which currency these financing projects are denominated and how these relate, like since, for example, the US sometimes, often are not in the vehicle, how this relates to the position of the dollar as a fundamentally de facto reserve currency for the world. And finally, I wanted to know whether, since I guess that most of these projects are financed in a currency that for the country receiving the financing is thought to be as a foreign currency, whether there are like infrastructure or institutional arrangements to manage this mismatch between the currencies.
Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Theodore, and I'm currently an NYU LLM student. My question goes specifically to Mrs. Lichtenstein, and I hope this time you can answer the question as this relates to your background. I'm really curious about the differences between AIIB and World Bank, aside from the fact that first it is a Chinese initiative, and within its articles it says that it wants to focus in the Asian regions, although I do understand that there are a lot of projects that doesn't really involve the Asian region. So I'm really curious to know the differences between AIIB and the existing international financing organization, and whether the fact that it was a Chinese initiative, does it affect the workings of the AIIB itself? For example, as Professor Cohen has indicated, is there any transparency issues that is going on within the AIIB that you think is different with the World Bank? That's my question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Gracie. I'm a student at NYU Law.
A word from our sponsor.
Yes. So Dr. Zhang had some very interesting remarks about the perception of the Belt and Road Initiative, and I think it's safe to say that China has somewhat of a perception problem around the BRI. And we also heard some interesting statistics from Aaron about the preferences of countries around the world about whether they prefer the US or China as their dominant superpower. So my question is, to what extent does or can or should the AIIB mitigate the concerns in the hearts and minds of these host nations, particularly given that it's a multilateral finance institution? Thank you.
And getting a preview of our next panel.
Thank you. My name is Ying Xia. I'm from Harvard Law School. I have 2 interrelated questions for Professor Jiang. A very interesting interpretation of Chinese perception of soft power message under the BRI. The first question is, who do you think is the audience for this soft message of the Chinese government? Is it meant for villagers from Africa who now have roads or schools in their village because of China, or is it for hinterland citizens or villagers from western part of China who can say, okay, now we don't even have enough jobs in China, why do you invest in Africa or elsewhere? And the interrelated question is, I agree that smaller countries would be more impressed by BRI than larger countries in terms of the capability of China to deliver infrastructure to the most remote corner of the world. But I wonder whether that part of the perception is a means or an end of itself. If it's just a means, what are the broader goals that China try to achieve after beyond this perception? Is it for seeking for alliance for international and domestic political issues, or is it simply political personal preference of some leaders, or something else? Thank you.
So we're going to let Natalie take a break. And Professor Zhang, why don't you respond to that question as well as Gracie's question about mitigating some of the, well, I guess, who is the target for the message and how do we improve the message?
So let me say, know nothing about the AIIB outside of what I've read from Natalie's books and heard her talks, so I really have to punt on that question. The gut instinct is to say that, especially in the hardcore finance context, there's not a ton of soft power involved. Basically, it's really, this is international interaction at its most sophisticated and at its most repeat player-ish. So I would be relatively surprised if the AIIB of all things had a huge amount to do with China's massaging of international perceptions. Now, going to Xia Ying's questions, they're great questions. I think the audience for the soft power audience for the BRI is always twofold, right? There's an international audience, which I would assume is largely targeted at foreign policy makers in foreign countries. And then there's a domestic audience, which basically is the Chinese polity. It's like the international one basically tries to enhance the not quite attractiveness of China as a partner, but like the salience of China as an international partner. So it makes China just seem much more visible, much more plausible, and perhaps much more politically plausible domestically for foreign countries to push as a partner in international arrangements and schemes and so on and so forth. It also makes lots of countries perhaps more likely to stay out of. So, like one scenario is China gets into this escalating, what Noah Feldman calls Cool War, or perhaps it's right now just the Cold War, or at least heading to in that direction with the U.S. Building an international perception of like strategic coherence, capacity, and strong military economic capabilities and so on and so forth, makes it more likely that lots of countries will not choose sides. They will not do like the gut instinct thing and align with the U.S. against, say, like a communist oppressor. This was pretty much what happened across the globe in the later 1980s, with fairly negative geopolitical consequences for the Soviet Union. They kind of want to avoid that kind of outcome, and so part of it is basically creating a large enough international perception of Chinese capacity so that other countries will at the very least, stay neutral when the Chinese begins to kind of escalate its confrontation with the U.S. Then domestically, it's a much more interesting set of questions, right? Like I think domestically, this kind of thing, this kind of like a relatively amoral power play that the BRI is currently perceived internationally to be, plays right into the way that Chinese nationalism is currently being shaped. Chinese nationalism is not terribly like morally substantive for the most part. It's created on a perception of like domestic wealth, prestige, and power. It's not based on any kind of like domestic perception of the moral or ethical attractiveness of the Chinese model and so on and so forth. And so insofar as Chinese citizens perceive the BRI also to be a sign that the center has a grand strategy, that the center is being expansionist, is flexing its muscles internationally in this planned, coherent, well thought out way, that is almost sure to kind of like substantially increase the central government's domestic prestige, and therefore bolster its popularity insofar as the Chinese population becomes increasingly nationalist. So that's my take on this. It's kind of a cynical take. I don't necessarily believe the Chinese population really cares about whether China is being liked internationally. It cares much more about whether China is being kind of like feared or respected, perhaps grudgingly internationally as a major power. And it doesn't have the illusions that in some cases the American population tends to have, that the U.S. is always seen as the good guy. Like I'm not sure that the vast majority of Chinese educated netizens care that much, for example, of whether China is seen as a good guy internationally. They care much more about whether China is seen as powerful. And this is exactly the domestic perception that this kind of thing is meant to project.
So currency, and how is the AIIB like and not like the World Bank?
Okay, and a little soft power, if I may.
And as much soft power as you'd like.
Okay. So I'm actually really grateful to those of you who ask questions that I can't answer. I don't know if any of you ever have those dreams where you go in to take an exam in a course and you didn't take the course. So I've taken this one. Thank you very much. Nightmare aspects gone. So so on the financial aspects of AIB, first, I'm not a finance lawyer, but I really found it interesting through all of these institutions, the importance of the financial contributions. They're set up like corporations, so you have shares, and to a greater or lesser extent, voting power depends on shareholding. And shareholding is determined sometimes transparently and sometimes not. One of the differences in AIB is that it's very clear in the public negotiating minutes agreement that GDP will be the basis for deciding shareholding. One of the differences in AIB compared to the World Bank is that the weight of shareholding in voting power, which is a different thing, is less. That means that smaller countries have a little bit more voice than they do. The bigger countries have proportionately less. So, for example, in AIB, it's about 85% of the voting power depends on money, on shareholding. In the World Bank, it's now about 95%. What does this mean in AIB? So you'll see China has about 30 to 31% of the shareholding. It has 26.5% of the voting power. Fiji has 0.01% of the shareholding and 0.1% of the voting power. So it just depends on size. Those of you who are economists will be able to explain it better than I can. So the financing and the money matters for a lot of different things. The money, however, in the case of AIB, it is a US dollar denominated bank, like most of the others. Some are euro, some are US dollar. And so that, I think, there were apparently some, I've seen commentary suggesting that AIB was going to be part of the renminbi internationalization. I have not, in the time I was associated with it, seen how that would work. But for all of these institutions, if you're the bank, you would like to lend in loans in the same currency in which your capital is denominated. And if there is foreign currency risk in the project, you would like the borrower to take that risk. So there are arrangements made, and they would be analyzed as part of the financial viability of the project for the country to be able to take the foreign exchange risk and how that would apply to the project and what kind of hedging you would need. In terms of other differences between the World Bank and AIB, again, I won't tell you the whole book. There are some differences in governance, not only the voting power, but also the balance to the non-resident board is to have a much more explicit requirement of the board's oversight of the management. There's also a provision for the board to delegate decision-making authority on projects to the president, to the management, within a certain parameters. They've just done that. And I think that that will be very beneficial as long as the oversight is properly exercised. There is a requirement for transparency. There is a somewhat nerdy legal difference, and that is that there are a lot of places in the AIB charter that provide for flexibility. I think, at least my suggesting that, I don't know why the parties agreed to it, was because in the World Bank, where the charter almost never gets amended, you have to bend and twist new proposals to fit within the lawyer's view of the language, which is, as Ko-Young can tell you, great fun for the lawyer, but not necessarily a good thing for the institution. And so in a number of places, for example, AIB can make loans, take equity and guarantee, and provide technical assistance. And it also says, and other types of financing approved by the Board of Governors. So if the financial wizards come up with something that kind of 90% smells like a loan, rather than tweaking it to make it smell 100% like a loan, just propose this in a way that makes the most sense for the recipient, for the bank, and get the right level of governance to approve it. So I would say that also somebody mentioned AIB working outside of Asia. There is a provision, and they've now adopted a strategy on AIB having projects that benefit Asia but are not physically located in Asia. The first one was very easy. It was solar power plants in Egypt, which is right over the line of definition. The last piece I'll say about the charter is there is also a unique provision that says the charter refers to all the persons as he, and it says references in this agreement to a specific gender applied to any gender. So that is unusual, and I hope it is part of AIB's preparation for the future. In terms of soft power, I just want to say that I think AIB in 2015 contributed enormously, in 16 maybe also, to China's soft power, because nobody expected this, I think, to have the reception that it did. There were 22 countries in Asia signed the first memorandum. There were 26 at the first negotiation. If it had ended there, you know, I wouldn't have written the book and this wouldn't be an interesting topic. But whether it's because when the UK decided to come in mid-March that it became a flap between the UK and the US and got lots of press, in the remaining 2 weeks of eligibility, another 19 countries came in and suddenly you had 57. And so I think that was a real unintended benefit to Chinese soft power, that they were seen as having set up this institution, which has kind of normal-looking legal frameworks and policies that are all posted on the web. But how long that will last, that was then, this is now. So who knows?
Okay. So we are pretty much out of time. Don't worry, there's a lot of Belt and Road action planned ahead for the rest of the afternoon. Jerry, you've been very quiet for the last 10 minutes. Did you have any final thoughts you wanted to
I hope they're not final.
for this panel?
I did want to hear from Ko Young Tung, who can say a word about investor-state relations, an area that I don't know much about, and makes the transition to our next panel.
He's resisted my invitations, but now it seems
I
like
didn't
he
know
wants
that.
to be the first on the coffee line, so he's stood up.
I'll be brief. One of
You'll
the
be
problems
brief?
being with Jerry is that he was my professor, and if you're the student and he's the professor, he can always call on you. But I have lots of thoughts and lots of things to say, but I'll make a couple of observations. One is, and Natalie will remember this, at the World Bank, our then president had a big, open house or whatever, he made these announcements in the atrium, and he said, we are doing God's work. And of course, we all felt that we were all angels doing great work, but the outside world didn't think that all the time. The same thing here with the Chinese BRI. I think is a great concept. In practice, everybody knows these projects are very, very difficult. And here again, I will quote my great leader, the president of the World Bank, who famously said, damn those dams, meaning doing dam projects is so difficult that the World Bank actually suspended doing them for a long time until we had an international commission who studied and that we have a maybe a better way of doing it. But all these infrastructure projects are damningly difficult. Therefore, the soft power or the hard power or whatever the power may be, I think this one Belt, One Road grand scheme may come back to bite the Chinese in areas that may be uncomfortable. So, and I'll do one thing on this, it's related. There's a lot of talk, and all international arbitrators like me, we get really, really excited. Oh, more jobs, more appointments. However, one of the problems, and Hiroko Yamamoto there, and I are writing a paper, one of the problems that I have not been able to solve is that the so-called ISDS, Investor-State Dispute Settlement, is that it goes one way. The foreign investor gets to bring action against the host country, right? So in OBOR or BRI situation, the foreign investor is the Chinese party, the respondent is the host country, right? So where you have issues where the Chinese investor or country has breached certain thing, the host investee cannot bring an international arbitration. So it's a one-way dispute settlement mechanism. And unless you can solve that, it's never going to be an equal forum to solve these issues. So I look forward to the next panel and thank everybody there. Thank you.
All right. So I was trying to think of something witty to say, but I can't top, that pun-filled discussion of dams. And so we'll just end it here. Everyone, please, round of applause for our panelists. And